This is the second event under a new series of cultural events that Kuch Khaas is planning. So, without going into further detail, we are very delighted to have Shehryar Fazli this afternoon, and although it is Ramzan timing, but he's traveling tomorrow, and he's been very kind to take off some time and be here. And I thought that I don't know about his. I mean, he's always traveling. So when he was next here in the capital, so this was the time to grab him and bring him to Kuch Khaas. Shehryar needs no introduction. Most of you know him, but surely he has emerged as one of the new voices in Pakistani literature, and if one were to say South Asian writing in English, which is flourishing and which is finding newer and newer meanings and touching upon sort of taboo themes, as well as presenting an alternative narrative on South Asia, in particular Pakistan. And this is the interesting part about English fiction, which is emanating from writers of Pakistani origin or those from South Asia, that they somehow address both the audiences, both at home as well as a very vast global audience, which these days is very much interested in Pakistan and what happens in Pakistan, and unfortunately mostly for the wrong reasons. So Shehryar's first book, Invitation, which I read as the editor of the Friday Times. I used to edit, and we published a review which unfortunately was not that flattering, Shehryar, and I apologize for that. But one has to keep up but of course there were some other very good reviews and very solid feedback, and even that reviewer who looked at it highlighted the fact that this was a narrative and this was a style which was unique for its originality. And so Shehryar's prose is actually distinctive for three reasons. One, that it brings forth a very original style of writing. It is not aiming to either copy a known or an established author. Number two, it is not going at the run-of-the-mill stories with the bombs exploding in Kissa Khani Bazaar of Peshawar, or some suicide bomber finding his suicide belt in one of the agencies of Fatah. Or for that matter, any other stereotype that we do find in such fiction. And I think the third important element of that, what Shehryar tried to do was, and which was very close and dear to Kuch Khaas's mandate as well, is how he tried to recreate and reimagine a lost city of Karachi, which was Pakistan's premier cosmopolitan place, and a very inclusive secular place, which still remains to date, despite all the advancement of Islamism and fundamentalism in that area. And how he tried to dabble that, and he dabbles it maybe through family history, through imagination, through archival research. We'll find out soon as we start talking to him. But I think it was a very important narrative to not only speak to the Western or the global audience about Pakistan, but also primarily at home, because the younger Pakistanis and the younger generation of Pakistanis have little idea about what Pakistan was, whether it is Karachi, whether it is Lahore, which was primarily a non-Muslim city, and overnight, after 47, it turned into a Muslim city, and now you have, more and more advancement of fundamentalism and forces which have gripped Lahore around it. So if you know, Murid Ke is an infamous location, and it is just a few kilometers away from Lahore, and that is where you have the whole jihad industry flourishing. And same is the case for Karachi, where you have some of the most notorious seminaries and other networks, and now many observers and reporters have collated the fact that Al-Qaeda may have its base in Karachi after it's been driven out of the mountains from northwest of Pakistan. So today's event, we are going to structure it in a way. I'm going to request Shehryar to speak a bit about his book. I would request him to read some excerpts from Invitation.
As for the autobiographical element in the book is also quite racy, and the character is not the most likable of people. So, especially in this company, I feel compelled to say that it's not autobiographical. And that's something that was a caveat, a disclaimer I gave, especially to family. I think that one quote that I've always really liked, I think it's from either George Eliot or Evelyn Waugh, who said that fiction is experience transformed. And I think that the transformation, for me, is a critical element. A lot of first novelists tend to be extremely autobiographical, and that's something that I didn't want to do. I wanted to use sort of the raw material of experience to create something afresh rather than simply reproduce or transcribe events that have already happened. The closest resemblance to real life in this book are the characters. A lot of the characters in this book are either composites of people I know, some of them live in this town, or in one particular case, it's straight out, this character is straight out of real life. I mean, I didn't even change her name because she was so compelling a figure that I didn't want to amend anything. But I think it's more the themes that are very close to my own experience. The theme of being away from your own country for a long time, of losing the language and then reacquainting yourself with it, trying to reclaim a place in the country is something that I, in a very different context to this book, have grappled with. So the short answer to summarize is that it's not immediately autobiographical, but it does certainly borrow a lot from my experiences.
Let's move to the reading bit.
Okay, sure.
So why don't you read us an excerpt which you like from the novel, and before you do that, just give the context of where the plot is or where the characters are.
Sure.
Sort of heading towards, and then...
The novel is set in 1970 Karachi, and the protagonist is this young man named Shahbaz who has just returned from 19 years of exile in Paris. His father was part of the communist conspiracy coup attempt in '51. As a result of that, he's been in Paris and refuses to ever come back to the country, but he eventually sends his son back to settle a family property dispute. And meanwhile, in a very radically changing Pakistan, Shahbaz is looking to reclaim a place in the Karachi aristocracy, reclaim a place in his country. And he becomes very dependent on individuals to help make that happen. And one of those individuals is a Bengali taxi driver named Ghulam Hussain. What I'm about to read is a moment in the book that gets at the heart of their relationship between the wealthy Shahbaz and the taxi driver Ghulam Hussain. A second thing happened the night the brigadier invited me to stay in his home. When we left, Ghulam Hussain drove absent-mindedly, humming a tune at the wheel, and often not really watching the road until prompted by the honks of angry neighboring cars to straighten out. To crack this absence, I asked him what the song was. A Bengali folk tune, he explained, and translated it to Urdu, which I then did my best to say back in English to myself, something along the lines of, "Let's go, let's go, let's go. From the skies the drums are beating, and the earth is getting restless. So children of the new sunset, let's go, let's go, let's go." The next thing to trap his attention was a disturbance near Kacheri Road, a procession being broken up by the police. Outside a pharmacy, amid the turmoil, 4 old men sat on stools around a Ludo board, each taking his turn rolling dice from a little cylinder focused on getting his game pieces home. Ghulam Hussain slowed the car almost to a standstill, watching these 4 men. And then a puzzled smile occupied his face, and only after I coughed did he return to his senses and speed up. A little concerned when he dropped me home, I asked him whether he was all right. "Haan, theek hoon," he answered distantly and unconvincingly. Then he returned the question, how was I doing here in this hotel? I too said I was all right, but realizing that it sounded just as false, I added, "Man gets bored," using the English word for bored, one of those that had become a standard substitute in Urdu. "Haan, Shahbaz bhai." And he said that he too was bored, but as one can in Urdu, without referring to himself as the subject. so that practically, word for word in English, boredom has occurred, making it sound like some foreign bug. And his idea of boredom was far darker than what I meant. We were talking about very different sentiments. I knew it was my role to console him. That's what he expected of me. In many ways, in most ways, he was so much smarter and more experienced and more able than I. There was everything between us that should have made him the knight and me the squire. But in an unjust city, I was now the one who had to lead him. I'd learned a new Urdu word recently for hope, umeed, and I rejoiced at this perfect opportunity to use it. Have umeed, I told him. After all, wasn't the country about to change? Without umeed, the world can't run, Shahbaz bhai. He rested both hands and arms against the top of the steering wheel, and now even put his head to it. Umeed, a very different word for him. But it's given me happiness to meet you, he said. Ha, to me too. And I meant it. But then you will go back to Paris over there, this too. And that's when I said it. You also come. Casually, imitating the elite cordial Pakistani insouciance. You also come, why not? The problem is that the rich say it to the rich and everyone knows the artifice. Oh, you're going to Paris? Yes, you also come. In a tone that suggests it would be silly not to. An aristocratic luxury being able to talk like that. But in Ghulam Hussain, something I'm certain changed. Not that he hadn't heard such things before, but because he'd heard it from me, someone who'd sat with him over breakfast in a cafe on Burns Road, who came to him in his quarters, straddled two worlds. I had no doubt that he thought me sincere. And in his moment of boredom, I came to him like an angel, not an angel from above, but more powerfully from the west. And is that why I did it, to bind him to me, to neutralize the threat he himself posed? No, it was something far simpler. I did it because of a language constraint. Piss off. Just like that, the fascist pricks. Which one of them did it, and why, he didn't know. What he knew was that he was off the list, and it was going to take 1,000 letters, phone calls, stratagems to climb back on, and that he may never. He'd knock on doors, wait and be humiliated. He'd miss out on deals, and his sister would say he wasn't made for this life or any life. And if it takes so many repugnant stratagems to be informed of a tender, to get a deal, to have them pass rather than fail your equipment, how many unmentionable acts does it take to get back on the list? Someone was behind this, and where that someone appeared in this infernal food chain would determine how quickly and through what tyrannies his license to deal arms would be restored to him. He'd done so many perverse and indictable things, giggled at all the wrong moments, failed to cover his tracks, that it was in fact amazing that it had taken this long for someone to make a play against him. But who in the end was it? Sheikh watched the credits roll beside his ex-wife's big face and thought again, I need you, Q. The brigadier and his friends were gone. The Raja was gone. He regretted letting the girls go too. He regretted not having taken one of them, or all of them. Yes, he wanted to lie naked with all three, not for sex, but just tenderness and contact with warm flesh. Shouldn't he have suggested it? Who cared if they thought him absurd? But they were gone and the office was empty. The madam had returned and taken them away, 45,000 rupees consumed. If he was not to make another deal anytime soon, he'd better start counting. Drunk, slouching in his one-seater, he pulled his phone out of his pocket and typed a text message that read, I need you, and scrolled down his address book to the letter Q, clicked on his ex-wife's number, and after inhaling deeply, clicked a second time, and off the message went, out of his control and immediately to be regretted. Modern technology, too easy to communicate and impossible to take one's words back. 3 momentous words, I need you, already with a woman he hadn't spoken to in how long had it been, over a year? It was now up to her alone to decide what response, if any, to give. His part was done, his self exposed. Sheikh Yusuf, he thought to himself, you fucking fool. But first, here's what happened that day in 1974. The young cop wasn't trying to be disrespectful to the new prime minister, a man he admired, followed, feared. But he always carried this thing inside him, this silly giggle that once provoked was nearly impossible to stop. It was, as he'd tell people later, like having champagne. And what was it on that grey day that started it? To his dying day, he said he didn't remember. What everyone who was in attendance did remember, however, was that as Bhutto was elaborating his profound revolutionary vision for the country to a relatively small, quiet audience considering other Bhutto events, that as Bhutto was speaking, sleeves rolled up and index finger wagging toward the future, a small but unequivocal sound could be heard, gentle at first but gathering volume as the minutes and precious prime ministerial words went by. A giggle, muffled by a hand over the mouth, but undeniably a giggle, sprouting through the lips and embarrassed hand of none other than young Sheikh Yusuf, who was standing in a row of other cops, third from the right. The giggling, didn't subside for some minutes, and it wasn't long before Bhutto turned his head. Every policeman in that line can still tell you about the look in the Prime Minister's swollen, apoplectic face. It took him a second to locate the offender, still with his hand over his mouth, and his insubordinate sounds escaping one by one like berserk hostages. Now, before discussing what happened next, it is worth re-emphasizing that the PM and Sheikh got along famously. Somehow, through no serious effort of his own, the young cop had made it into one of Bhutto's small social circles that included other young officers too, the PM always asserting a fondness for the younger generation that he believed was responsible for sacking the military and elevating him to the highest office. These youth convened in drawing rooms to drink whiskey and listen to the country's leader rant prophecies until the late hours. There were senior members of the party and other top officials too, but make no mistake that the Prime Minister was there to perform for the young. And among those younger addressees, how and why Bhutto picked that particular little man as a favorite, we'll never know. It is in fact entirely possible that it was the young Sheikh's giggle that endeared him to the leader. For Bhutto also had a cruel humor designed to humiliate, and while most listeners would perhaps smirk uncomfortably to descriptions, say, of the wife of the Speaker of Parliament having a mouth like a damned rabbit, young Sheikh, not in full control of his reactions, would giggle like a little girl. And it wouldn't stop. Eventually, the PM would turn his eyes toward the source with some surprise, and a moment later, in puzzled amusement, the Prime Minister himself would start chuckling again and reproduce his hysterical sketch of the lady's thin upper lip and long, spacious front teeth. Sheikh's giggling expanded as if it now had permission to come out in full. How welcome, too, that this new leader was sexually dynamic, unlike Pakistani leaders that came before, including the majestic Field Marshal, and certainly unlike the Founding Fathers, the chubby Liaquat and the reedy, disappearing Jinnah. Probably sexually more present than Nehru, too. To assess him against his contemporaries, there was, of course, no comparison to make with the august Mrs. Gandhi. So here we had him, Bhutto, with bodily movements of a perfect predator and a libido warming him from the center out. And nowhere more so than on stage, which is where we find him now, and behind him the young Sheikh that late summer morning in 1974. Bhutto has turned his head and identified Sheikh, who will never forget the look on the leader's face. The eyes at first fill with shock, and then beautifully the shock transforms, a magical transformation, into something else. The eyes that seemed about to burst now contracting, hardening, all in a matter of seconds. Then Bhutto turns his face to the crowd again. I've been telling you, brothers, sisters, that things are going to change. The imperialist devil left us a bureaucracy which the dictators used to their benefit, but not for your benefit. Now you run the country. Pakistan is yours. Sheikh senses something big is coming. People like this, the Prime Minister points behind him, pointing to no other than his young disciple while still facing his audience. People like this have gotten away with too much these 30 years. They have no respect for you. It is time they got what they deserve. Today, I will make an example of this officer who doesn't respect me, who doesn't respect you. This, I promise you. The crowd roars, and a young cop nearly pisses himself. Many people who had Bhutto's ear lobbied him on Sheikh's behalf in the ensuing weeks, reminding him of the promise that this young officer had displayed from day one, his commitment and loyalty to the government, reminding the Honourable Prime Minister that Sheikh Yusuf had scored the highest grade of his batch in the civil service exam. Yes, Bhutto would say, and nod emphatically to each point as it was repeated. He would even praise young Sheikh himself, agreeing that he was one of the most outstanding young men he'd ever come across. But, he then explained, he'd made a promise to the people. And so, young Sheikh was made an example of. He was made OSD, Officer of Special Duty. The designation sounded almost grand if you didn't know any better. But back home, anyone who knew anything knew that OSD meant demotion, reprimand, official limbo, neither here nor there, bureaucratically disowned. Sheikh Yusuf, OSD, made an example of, part of history. No more BS, it's the people's time. After a while, he couldn't stand it and resigned from service. Most men would have waited until their OSD term was over, and then they were reintegrated into the service proper. Not Sheikh. How could he? He was a man of honor, and honorably he left the force and was lost for several years, unhinged, unattached, helping out in the family silk business but never committing to it with his heart and soul. No uniform, no manhood, no lust for the world, until the day he was asked to serve another very powerful man, far more powerful in fact than the Prime Minister.
Perfect.